Do you see the Fed tapering? And if they do, how much is this going to affect inflation? And also, I know the market is saying the Fed's going to raise rates in 22, 23, but is this a reality at all? But before we jump into that, I just wanted to remind you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Well, I think the Fed will at least start the taper and see how it goes. The thing that is different with this taper is that it's coinciding with central banks around the world that are also beginning to remove accommodation. However slow, however glacial that process is, they're all outside of the BOJ, they're all doing it at once. So if the Fed starts to taper in December, which they basically told you that they will, well, the Bank of England could be raising rates in December. We recently got a rate hike from Norway a month or two ago from South Korea. We've had Canada and Australia trim QE. Even the ECB has trimmed QE. So there's a global shift to tightening. And I do believe tapering is tightening to define that. Just as we saw last year, for the past 18 months, obviously massive global easing. Now, I can't even discuss or the rate hike situation because I'm not even sure that they're going to be able to get through the tapering. If you look back to 2010, every single notable market correction in equities and also fixed income markets outside of COVID and the yuan devaluation in August 2015 coincided with the end of QE, where it was a hard stop, QE1 and QE2, and then obviously you had the taper of 2013, and then obviously around rate hikes, every single one coincided with a tightening of policy. And even again, it was gradual. It still affected markets, and we're going to have it again. To think that we're going to somehow get through tapering without any accidents, I think is delusional, and you believe that there's a free lunch. And it's a matter of what kind of accident occurs by this. Now, QE itself, essentially at the end of the day, it's an asset swap. And yeah, does some of that money sort of filter into markets? Yeah, maybe, I guess, but a lot of it's psychological. But it also does help to, at least on the short end, suppress interest rates to where they would be otherwise. That said, when QE has been on, you've been paid to steepen the curve. When QE is off, it pays to flatten it. And I think we've seen some recent flattening in the yield curve. And I think that has been the right trade to do when QE is about to turn off. But to Steve's point about the bottom 50%, well, if you get a short equity market correction, well, the top 50% is going to feel that as well. And yeah, can that filter into how they spend? For sure, but that doesn't necessarily resolve the supply issues. I mean, that's how this inflation story is going to recalibrate. The supply side is going to take a couple of years, and it's going to be less demand that is going to recalibrate this inflation story. And I think that is, no central bank wants to preside over a decline in the economy, but unfortunately, you're going to have a trade-off. Do you want lower inflation and a slower economy, or an economy as is, but fast inflation that's going to hurt the people that can least afford it?
Yeah, this balance sheet taper thing is really interesting because I will be on record, and I'll hold on record saying I don't think the Fed's going to do it. Although, as Peter mentioned, you just said that you think that the Fed's going to start and then quit. I've had to come to your side of the fence on that deal, mainly because when Powell spoke at Jackson Hole, it seemed like he was saying we can't make this mistake. We got to keep easing, because we could let off the gas too soon. And then for whatever reason, there was this massive pivot between that and the last meeting. And he's going to have a disadvantage going into the November FOMC and not have the non-farm payroll report, because he concludes this meeting on Wednesday, the non-farm payroll is out on Friday. Maybe he's got some early access, who knows? But it seems like all of a sudden he's in a panic to start tapering. Now, could this be because we know the Treasury is going to reduce their issuance of notes and bonds as we borrow less money, and he doesn't want to be over purchasing? Sure. Could it be, as Peter mentioned, that the other central banks are tapering and starting to raise hike rates? And that's interesting because the way I look at it is that would be a catalyst if the Fed doesn't start tapering, that the dollar goes higher. Well, there's part of the inflation story that almost nobody's looking at is what if the dollar, gets up into, 96, 97, maybe even close to 100. I mean, we're talking about destroying the inflation story just from the dollar alone. And is this one of those things where we had coordinated easing, so now we need to have coordinated tapering to keep the dollar from going up too much? Yeah, I'm not sure what his motivation is, but I will say this. There's no way that they get to the end of that taper. There's a 0% chance they're going to raise rates. And even if they did, it doesn't matter. They've effectively given the banks a pass by saying, look, there's no reserve requirement because, well, you've got all these QE reserves. You don't need any more. This whole idea that we're going to get this balance sheet unwound, I think the bond market's telling us the Fed's making a mistake. I think, Peter, you and I agree that we don't know how many months they're going to go. The only question is, at what point is there a payroll report or some data that comes out that the Fed goes, oh my God, we made a big mistake.
Powell doesn't. I'll tell you why he's doing this. Well, first of all, the whole purpose of monetary policy, as we know, is to push the demand side. And if you look at what are the two most interest rate sensitive parts of the economy, it's housing and autos. So is Powell, with a straight face, going to say, I need to pedal to the metal, continue to stimulate the demand for housing and autos when you can't find an auto and the price of the home's worth 20% more than last year? They need to take their foot off that demand pedal. And he does not want to be Arthur Burns. He does not want to be Arthur Burns. And right now, he is headed towards being Arthur Burns. And the Fed is going to reach a pivot point where, if inflation still remains sticky and persistent, but growth is really decelerating to a greater extent than it already is, and we know that the Atlanta Fed third quarter GDP numbers got a one handle on it, he's going to have to reach a point. Do I try to calm inflation, but then risk further weakness in the economy and a fall in asset prices, which Jay Powell obviously inflated, or is he going to just not really respond quick enough? And being in Washington, we can be sure he probably leans towards trying to save the economy, but then that creates its own problems. The one thing in the dollar is going to get tied into this too, because if he remains too easy for too long, well, that may sacrifice the dollar. If he is more aggressive at dealing with inflation, well, then you can see a faster move in the dollar. So he's just in an absolutely no-win situation here. And but there is going to be a pivot point where he's going to reach that. We'll have to see. Does he go down the Paul Volcker route, or is he going to continue down the Arthur Burns route?
See, Peter, you just said it best. He's in a no-win situation. And all we're debating is, at what point does he back off and quit because he realizes this is not working? I mean, we can look at the velocity of money and see that monetary policy is not functioning properly. I mean, there was a lot of people that predicted at the end of the last quarter that as the economy reopened, velocity would pop, but it didn't because of the fact that monetary policy is not transmitting into the economy. And so now the real issue is, if he starts tapering and it does do what it's supposed to do, does he inadvertently tighten financial conditions? I mean, this is such a mess of what he's got to deal with. And I don't know if you'll agree with me on this, but I don't think they have a clue what they're doing. I think they're just betting that this is all going to work out, that Powell as himself is going to get renominated, and that somehow in the end, either he's going to look like a superhero and say, look, see, I did it, and go out as one of the most celebrated Fed chairs than ever, or he's going to find someone else to blame this on when it doesn't work.
No, the Fed has been winging it for decades. And this all goes back to Greenspan. In 1994, he raised rates aggressively. We know he blew up Mexico, he blew up Orange County, California. And he took that at heart. He learned a lesson. And so you go into the late 90s when everything is on fire, stock market bubble. We know he was very slow to raise interest rates because he didn't want to repeat 1994. And then, of course, you have the blow up, and he's obviously quick to raise interest rates. But remember, in the mid 2000s, he raised, when he started raising interest rates, he did it every single meeting, and in every single statement it said, we are doing this at a measured pace, because he didn't want to repeat 1994. And then what we have, obviously, the housing bubble and so on and so on. So, and then now you take Powell. Powell got, well, we know Janet Yellen was afraid to raise interest rates. It took them 7 years to get up zero. And then after finally raising, it took them another 12 months to finally raise rates again. And then Powell started to pick up the pace, and then he blew himself up in the fourth quarter of 2018. And then that helps to explain why they're going so slow now. Then you throw in, of course, the whole social justice. The Fed's become the Ministry of Social Justice now, and how they view monetary policy. But yeah, to your point, they are winging it, and they've been winging it for decades.
And you bring up an interesting point about 2018. I'm really glad you did, because a lot of people forgot that we started easing at a point where it didn't really make a lot of sense from the outside looking in. And so now this whole notion, and I don't know what your reaction was, but I remember hearing the press conference when he's like, okay, when Powell said, we're gonna gradually unwind the balance sheet by mid 2022. I'm like, since when is gradual 6 months? Like there's no way this is gonna work for you, buddy. But good luck if you're going to pull it off.
Yeah, and the Fed got lucky for a period of time. They got lucky in 2017 because the markets rallied and ignored Fed rate hikes and the beginning of the shrinking of their balance sheet. They were double tightening, and they got bailed out because everyone focused on the corporate income tax cut that obviously happened at the end of 2017. But that entire year, the VIX got down to 8. Every dip was bought because everyone was pricing in that tax cut. But once that tax cut was in place, the Fed then raised interest rates again in January 2018. And then we immediately shift back to the Fed is double tightening here between the balance sheet and rates. And that obviously coincided with, the fourth quarter of 2018. So we know in the Fed tapering, the Fed tightens until they hit a wall. The Fed tightens until something breaks. And you can be sure something will break in 2022. It's just a matter of how deep they get, and also just one last point here is that having low inflation gives central banks, that Wayne's World concert pass, that all access to do anything they want for how long as they want when there's low inflation. But once you get inflation into the numbers, into the economy, their flexibility is greatly diminished. And that will be an interesting sort of tug of war as they get further into their tapering and something eventually breaks.
That's interesting. I have one last question, or a couple last questions. How do you feel about stagflation? I kind of am in the stagflation camp. Do you think that's a cop-out, or how do you feel about that?
I'll let Steve start on that.
Yeah, I think it's temporary. I mean, we're supposed to see rising unemployment. I mean, I guess with people coming off the ranks, I don't know, maybe it'll go back up. I don't think that's likely to happen. And then you tend to get that with higher prices. But when we start looking at the bond market is starting to tell us that, hey, the stagflation is going to be transitory. And then the risk that I see is that we get into outright deflation from here.
So I to me, I just look at stagflation as just, slower growth and higher inflation. And, in an economist textbook, they think that slow growth means lower prices, faster growth means higher prices. I mean, just look at the Bank of Japan. The Bank of Japan said, we need to get inflation at 2%, and somehow that will then generate faster growth. To me, they've got that backwards. You need stable prices in order to develop and sustain healthier growth. So right now but the stagflation, it's sort of intertwined in the sense that it's the inflation and what is driving so it's the inflation itself that is beginning to impact consumer spending. And it's the factors that are creating the inflation, like the supply bottlenecks, that in itself are also creating slower growth.
Excellent. Then one last question, just for a thought experiment. I mean, say Powell does leave the Fed next year, and they'll find a dove, right? So what does the Fed look like at that point? If, we have a dove as Fed chair.
Well, 2022 becomes completely politicized. The Fed's already politicized, but it becomes uber politicized in 2022 because of the elections in November. And if Lael Brainard becomes the next Fed chair in February 2022, you can be sure that Steve and I are right, that there's no chance in hell they're going to finish this taper, because the second something breaks, they're going to back off, and they're going to do their best to, or at least the Democrats headed by Lael Brainard will do their best to maintain control of Congress.
Yeah, I think I'll put that as a low probability chance that Powell is out. If he does, I 100% agree with
I
you.
agree. I think he stays as well.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. I think it's a big risk for the Biden administration to pull him. I mean, he hasn't really done anything wrong, but if he does, I think Peter's spot on. I mean, now it becomes even more political than the Fed is supposed to be. And he's right. As soon as something goes wrong, I mean, we're going to 120 billion a month. Yeah, right. It'll be multiples of that in a second.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both again for everything you shared with us today. If you can you each tell us where we can find you on social media or otherwise?
Well, I just want to say thank you to Tracy and Steve. Thank you for having me debate and discuss this with you. It was definitely a fun time. If you want to read my daily readings, you can subscribe to bookreport.com, BOOCK report.com, and our wealth management businesses at bleakley.com.
Excellent.
Tracy, I want to thank you as well. And Peter, you and I know this has been a long time coming for us to be on the same screen together. I had a blast. Totally look forward to the next time. And for those who want to find more about me, you could go to my website at stephenvanmeter.com, on Twitter at Meter Stephen Metra is how it's pronounced, how it's spelled, and not pronounced, and on YouTube at Stephen Van Meter Financial.
Great. And for everyone watching, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we look forward to seeing you on the next Quick Hit.